On November 13th and 14th, 1982, the African People's Socialist Party held the first World Tribunal on reparations for African people in the U.S. in Brooklyn, New York. The tribunal was presided over by its people's advocate, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. While the concept of reparations for African people was not new, reparations was hardly in common parlance at that time and far from a mass demand. As part of the process of promoting the tribunal, the African People's Socialist Party set a goal to make reparations a household word. The fact that today the word reparations is shouted from the lips of millions of protesters, discussed on primetime TV, and written about in everything from the Wall Street Journal to social media posts can be attributed to that effort by the party nearly 40 years ago to proclaim to the world that African people are owed trillions of dollars in reparations by the U.S. government and white population. $4.1 trillion in 1982 dollars, to be exact, was the ruling of the panel of international judges who heard the indictment and testimonies at the tribunal. The $4.1 trillion was for the labor stolen from African people from unpaid and underpaid wages from the period of chattel slavery until 1982. As Chairman Omali summed up, "We'll get the damages later." The World Tribunal was one of the most historic events in the legacy of the centuries-long struggle for the liberation of African people. As the people's advocate, Chairman Omali Yeshitela used established international law to indict the U.S. government for its treatment of African people. This proceeding set a precedent for the right of African people to assume state power. It carried out Malcolm X's call for African people to take the U.S. government to the World Court. Chairman Omali Yeshitela used international law as defined by the International Court of Justice, along with the Charter of the United Nations, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Bill of Human Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide to make the indictment.
On today, we are initiating a two-day trial of the United States government for crimes it has committed against the black or African population of the United States.
During his opening statements, Chairman Omali Yeshitela posited that the birth of capitalism and the resultant wealth of the current social system was brought about through the assault on Africa and the centuries of enslavement of African people. The chairman argued that reparations to African people is the true redistribution of the wealth of the world into the hands of the producers. As the people's advocate, Chairman Omali Yeshitela also showed that African people inside the U.S. live under colonialism, the domination of a whole people by a foreign and alien state power for profit. The two-day proceedings were packed with testimonies from experts such as African history professor Leonard Jeffries and activists such as the revered Queen Mother Moore, who had been a part of the Marcus Garvey movement years earlier. Afeni Shakur, who had been a Black Panther and political prisoner, also spoke. There was detailed testimony from medical workers, mental health experts, educators, prisoners, and everyday African workers who gave moving statements about the brutality of their lives under colonialism inside the U.S. At the end of the process, the panel of international judges unanimously ruled the United States is guilty of the crime of genocide against African people and all other charges. The panel voted that African people in the U.S. must be paid the $4.1 trillion in reparations and that imprisoned black revolutionaries should be given prisoner of war status based on the Geneva Convention, among other rulings. In his visionary and prophetic opening statements, Chairman Omali, the people's advocate, eloquently presented the case.
This World Tribunal, the people present, and our international observers must affirm the authority and legality of these proceedings. Otherwise, there will be no peace on the face of this earth, for the oppressed and colonized African community in this country has demonstrated over and over that we will fight for our freedom. Indeed, U.S. prisons are filled with the sons and daughters of our struggle for freedom. This World Tribunal must affirm the legality of these proceedings in order to validate within the international community those whose love of freedom is so great that they would put their lives and limited freedom on the line in its pursuit and defense. Sisters and brothers, Africans and peoples of the world, to do less than this, to withhold the right to justice and international legality to the powerless, oppressed African people in the United States would be to validate the most cynical concept that might makes right. It would give credence and validity to the awful concept of the right of the powerful to make and enforce international law. Such law as that is no law at all. It is accepted tyranny. Therefore, this World Tribunal must determine whether international morality might prevail in the interest of the powerless. This tribunal will determine whether, even in the absence of state power, the rights of the oppressed will be recognized as rights which may be respected in the form of applied international law, whether they may be respected in the form of an international trial of an oppressor state power.
It is with the gravity and urgency of this period of history that we bring this historic case and rulings from 4 decades ago to the white population. In the words of Chairman Omali Yeshitela, written in Vanguard, every white aspiration and dream, every expectation for happiness and a good life requires drone strikes in Pakistan, police murders and mass imprisonment in the African colonies and barrios of the US, and starvation and forced displacement of the oppressed of the world. We make the case that the 4.1 trillion are just the tip of the iceberg of capitalist extraction benefiting us at the expense of African people. The time is now for us of the white population to rectify our relationship to African people and join humanity, not as a benefactor of their suffering, but as a contributor to a new world, shared by all, no one at the expense of another. This is the time for the parasitic ruling class of this country and all those with access to social wealth to pay reparations as a revolutionary demand rather than charity, returning the stolen resources into the programs led by the African working class, building their own self-determined political and economic power to uplift the entire African population.